Hello. The episode you're about to listen to is part of a multi part series introducing an overview of Japanese history. This is a repeat of one of the original projects the History of Japan podcast was built on, and is intended to serve as an update and supplement to these original works. After 10 years, my hope is to return to this approach and to do it a little bit better given the skills that I have improved in the intervening years. If you haven't been doing so already, you should listen to these episodes sequentially, starting with episode 501. Without any further ado, enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 533, At the Table or On the Table. The last two episodes have been about Japan after the end of feudalism and the country's struggle with modernity, with figuring out what strengthening Japan meant in terms of balancing the demands of tradition and change in the fields of politics, economics, and society. But there's one thing we haven't talked about yet, which, in the 1800s, was viewed as an integral part of modernity itself. All of the great powers of the West, and many of the minor ones too, had empires, and the pursuit of empire was considered part and parcel of what made modernity, well, modern. Empire, of course, has a long history in Europe, America, and everywhere else. And the conversation around what made the empires of the 19th century West different from those of the past, or even how different they really were, is an interesting academic conversation that we don't really have time for here. One thing that was distinct about most 19th century Western empires, though, was their focus on economics. Western empire during the Victorian era was driven primarily by economic rationales. For example, this is why France, Germany, and the UK carved out exclaves from China at gunpoint so those territories could be a base to push into the China market. That wasn't true of every imperial acquisition of the period. Germany, for example, snapped up control of Micronesia in the West Pacific, not for economic reasons, but just because its leaders didn't want to feel they'd been left out in the scramble for Asian colonies. And of course, there were older established colonial ventures in place, the British hold over India, for example. But in terms of the rationale of empire, the argument for it, that was largely economic, at least when it wasn't being couched in the language of the so-called white man's burden to civilize the world, a phrase I cannot possibly put enough air quotes around. And I mention this because when we look at Japan's empire, we're going to see something very different. The Japanese empire of the Meiji period and onward absolutely had an economic component, and there was even language around civilizing the locals that would have been familiar to colonial overseers from Britain or France. But the argument for empire was made first and foremost in military terms. Indeed, arguably Meiji Japan's first conquests were Hokkaido and the Ryukyus, both of which had been loosely attached to the Tokugawa shogunate but still independent in a sense. That ended in the Meiji period. Hokkaido was formally annexed in 1869, and a colonization office set up to ship settlers over to the island, mostly from the defeated side of the Boshin War. That's also why Hokkaido dialect is relatively close to standard Japanese, because historically speaking, it's pretty new. The Ryukyuan kingdom, meanwhile, was formally annexed in 1878, with a government program of forced assimilation of the natives being put into place, replacing, for example, the Ryukyuan language with standardized Tokyo dialect Japanese. The rationale in both these cases was that Hokkaido and Okinawa were necessary to protect the home islands. They could not be allowed to fall into the hands of potentially hostile neighboring powers, like Russia or the United Kingdom. The same rationale also justified the First Sino-Japanese War, the first of Japan's overseas colonial wars, and this was very much a colonial war intended to secure Japan's dominion of Korea away from another regional power, China. More or less from the advent of the Meiji period, Japan's relations with Korea had become increasingly tense. Korea's Confucian monarchy was deeply conservative and rejected all attempts by Western powers to force an end to their seclusion laws, which were pretty similar to Japan's. Japan was actually the first country to force Korea to sign an unequal treaty in 1876, making use of the nascent power of the Imperial Japanese Navy to threaten the Koreans into agreeing. By the 1880s, Japan had an extensive sphere of economic and political interest in Korea, bolstered by a faction within the Korean government which supported Meiji-style reforms in Korea itself. Japanese interest in the peninsula was driven, again, primarily by military interest. As Jakob Meckel, the German staff officer who trained Japan's first general staff, put it, Korea was a dagger pointed square at the heart of Japan. It was an ideal jumping-off point for any power, in other words, planning to invade Japan itself. However, Japan was not the only power with a colonial interest in Korea. In the aftermath of the Taiping Rebellion, the Qing dynasty of Korea had entered a period of revival and increasing assertiveness, and its historically close relationship with Korea made it a growing influence on the peninsula. In addition, factions of the Korean government supported a close relationship with Imperial Russia, the third major power in the region and a potential counterweight, so the thinking went, to Chinese and Japanese influence, while still providing a valuable source of industrial and technological knowledge. Over the course of the 1880s, relations between these three powers over the question of Korea became increasingly tense, but never directly hostile. Japan and China, in particular, signed a convention at Tianjin demilitarizing the peninsula and promising that each would inform the other if their forces were ever dispatched to Korea in order to keep tensions between them low. This worked for a time, but eventually the Japanese leadership in Tokyo decided to make a play to drive China from the region and seize Korea for itself, especially once attempts to seize control of Korea by other means, for example supporting a pro-Japanese coup in 1884, had failed. The impetus for war came in 1894, with the beginning of a peasant uprising in Korea known as the Donghak movement. Donghak in Korean means Eastern Learning. The Donghaks were a political and religious uprising among Korean peasants, calling to rectify the ills of Korean society by returning to traditional Korean values. The rebellion was substantial enough that the Korean king, Gojong, sent to Beijing requesting Chinese reinforcements to put the rebellion down, something which had happened in the past thanks to the long-standing relationship between the two countries. The Chinese happily said yes, and informed Japan of their plans to dispatch forces to Korea per the rules of the Tianjin Agreement. Here at last was the moment of opportunity. In Tokyo, the political leadership decided to take a risk and seize the chance to drive China out of Korea once and for all. How do you manufacture a crisis in a moment like this? Well, if you're the Japanese government, you claim you never got any notice from China regarding its forces going to Korea. Thus, the Tianjin Agreement has been broken, and it's time to mobilize our armies. On July 25, 1894, using this deeply flimsy pretext, Japan declared war. Outside observers were not generally too sanguine about Japan's chances. After all, the country was massively outnumbered by China's military, and the most direct opponents of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were China's Beiyang Army and Navy, some of the most modernized elements of the Qing dynasty's military. By contrast, Japanese forces were untested in a conflict of this scale. They'd mostly fought civil wars up to this point, not to mention the logistical challenge of moving large numbers of men on slow, vulnerable troop transports from Japan onto the Asian mainland. Despite these pessimistic forecasts, the war was a decisive victory for Japan. Japanese forces swiftly marched on Seoul and seized control of the Korean throne, and drove the advancing Chinese forces out of Korea with ease. On land, the Imperial Japanese Army swept aside Chinese forces, pushed across the northern Korean border into Manchuria in northeastern China, and from there continued to advance, winning every battle along the way. At sea, Chinese fleets were decisively crushed by the Imperial Navy in the Yellow Sea, a Japanese invasion force landed on both Taiwan and the Shandong Peninsula opposite Korea, seizing Taiwan itself and defeating a massive Chinese garrison at Weihaiwei on Shandong. The war ended in April of 1895 with an overwhelming Japanese victory. The Qing dynasty of China was forced to accept both a loss of its sphere of influence in Korea and the Japanese seizure of Taiwan, as well as the Liaodong Peninsula north of Korea proper. China was also forced to pay a cash indemnity to cover the cost of the war. Meanwhile, Japan suffered just over 1,000 combat deaths in total. Far more men were lost to disease caused by lack of hygiene than in battle. China's most advanced armies and navies had been crushed. One of the flagships of its new modern fleet, the Zhenyuan, was captured by the Japanese and recommissioned as an Imperial Japanese Navy warship. Japan had won its first colonial conflict in decisive fashion. In the aftermath of the Sino-Japanese War, Korea became a colonial dependency of Japan, with its monarchy subject to Japanese advisors, who largely ran things behind the scenes. 15 years later, Japanese leaders would drop the pretense and formally annex Korea into the Japanese Empire. The next half-century of colonial rule in Korea would see a brutal mistreatment of the locals, whose language and customs were suppressed in the name of Japanization, while the people were exploited with extractive taxation, and attempts at political dissent were brutally and violently crushed. A similar fate awaited Taiwan, where particularly brutal treatment was doled out to Aboriginal tribes in the island's mountainous interior who resisted Japanese rule, including aerial bombardments making use of poison gas. While this war was a military success for Japan, its political ramifications were far more mixed. In particular, Japan was shortly faced with a demand from Imperial Russia, backed by Germany and France, both of which cared a lot more about an alliance with Russia than good relations with Japan, demanding that Japan return the Liaodong Peninsula to Chinese rule. Ostensibly, the point of this so-called triple intervention was to ensure China was not punished too harshly or destabilized politically by defeat. Practically, this was a cynical play by the Russians, who wanted the Liaodong Peninsula for themselves and knew they had a better chance of forcing the Chinese to give it to them than taking it from the Japanese. The triple intervention, to which Japan had no choice but to accede, after all, it couldn't fight a war against Russia, Germany, and France, sparked intense nationalist furor and was a major impetus towards war with Russia a decade later. And that war, in turn, drove an increasingly destructive dynamic in Japanese policy that we're going to see pretty clearly over the next couple of weeks. Korea, over the years, would become economically a very valuable colony for Japan, even though the rationale for seizing it had been military. Indeed, it was so valuable that right up to the end of the Second World War, one of the major sticking points in terms of ending the conflict was a desire for the political leadership in Tokyo to hang on to the peninsula. And that in turn meant that a desire to secure Korea, the southern tip of which was transformed into a breadbasket for the empire, while the north was industrialized to defend the colonial frontier, ended up driving the same military dynamic that had led to the invasion of Korea in the first place. What do I mean by that? Well, the clique of Meiji autocrats had believed they needed Korea to keep Japan safe. They demanded the Liaodong Peninsula from China out of a belief that it was necessary to protect Korea. When the Liaodong Peninsula was eventually taken from the Russians, the thinking became that control of all of Manchuria was necessary to secure the Liaodong Peninsula, which was necessary to secure Korea, which was necessary to secure Japan. Then when that happened, a new generation of military leaders began suggesting, you know what, in order to secure Manchuria, which we need to hang on to the Liaodong Peninsula, which we need to defend Korea, which we need to defend Japan, we also really need a good chunk of China and the Russian Far East under our control. In other words, as new frontier territories were incorporated into the empire, they in turn became justifications for expanding the empire to protect these new territories. This mindset ultimately led squarely to the destruction of the Japanese Empire in World War II. But we're a ways from that yet, and we've got one more big war to talk about first. You see, more or less immediately from the conclusion of Japan's war with China in 1895, it was obvious that war with Russia was on the horizon. The Triple Intervention, spearheaded by Russia alongside Germany and France, and aimed at forcing Japan to give the Liaodong Peninsula back to China, again really inflamed nationalist sentiment in Japan and anger at the Russians, who, of course, promptly seized the peninsula for themselves, high-minded notions of stabilizing China notwithstanding. 5 years later, Russian military leaders seized on the excuse provided by the Boxer Rebellion in China, which was suppressed by an alliance of nations including both Japan and Russia, to move large numbers of forces into Manchuria in northeastern China to support the suppressing of the Boxer Rebellion, forces which were still in the process of withdrawing 5 years after the rebellion ended. When the Chinese government at Beijing demanded the return of occupied territory in Manchuria in 1903, the Russian response was to issue their own ultimatum, essentially demanding complete control over the administration and economy of Manchuria before its troops would leave. This crisis was viewed with some consternation in Tokyo, particularly because the Russians reinforced their positions by moving troops close to the northern border of Korea, which again is now a Japanese protectorate and considered by military leaders to be vital to the security of the empire. In Tokyo, some leaders of the Meiji aristocracy, like Ito Hirobumi, counseled caution. Others, like the patron of the army, Yamagata Aritomo, took a way harder line and were bolstered when news arrived early in the summer of 1903 that Russian forces had occupied part of the Yalu River estuary that was technically on the Korean side of the border and begun constructing fortifications. Russia was clearly trying to intimidate the government in Tokyo and likely aiming for the longer-term seizure of at least part of Korea. Japanese forces, by the estimates of its military leaders, did have a numerical edge on their Russian counterparts both on land and at sea, but it wouldn't last for more than a few years as Russia continued to fortify the region and move troops into it. In these circumstances, the calls for war on the Japanese side grew more and more fervent, particularly after 1902 when Japan penned its first overseas alliance with Great Britain. That alliance wouldn't bring the United Kingdom into a war automatically, but it would prevent other countries from intervening in a war with Russia, since by the terms of the alliance, the UK would enter the conflict on Japan's side if more than one power declared war on Japan. In other words, the Anglo-Japanese alliance, as it's known, ensured that any war with Russia would be one-on-one, and the Tsar could not bring in other allies as he had with the Triple Intervention, because then he would have to face down the United Kingdom, the world's foremost power. By late 1903, a tenuous consensus had emerged in Tokyo that negotiations to get the Russians to pull some forces out of Asia should be tried, since that would at least make Korea more secure. But if this didn't work, the answer had to be war. The Russian response to Japanese proposals to negotiate was to ignore them, and so on February 3, 1904, a war council in the presence of the emperor decided to strike. On February 5th, forces were secretly mobilized, and on the 8th, the first shots were fired. Japan's strategy for the war was comparatively simple. To begin with, Russia's Far Eastern Fleet, based in the warm water port of Port Arthur in Manchuria, today the city of Dalian, had to be neutralized. To pull this off, the Imperial Japanese Navy would rely on a little bit of subterfuge, a timed strike that lined up just with the delivery of a declaration of war to St. Petersburg, so that Japan didn't technically violate the laws of war with a surprise attack, but forces in Port Arthur would not be prepared. This worked pretty well, and it might sound a bit familiar because it will be the blueprint for another such try in 1941. The attack pinned the Russian Far Eastern Fleet in place and sank 2 of its battleships with no losses on the Japanese side. The sea thus secured, massive numbers of Japanese troops could be ferried to the mainland without fear of the transports being sunk. The goal of the army would be to advance rapidly into Manchuria and defeat the Russians decisively. Thus, the Tsar would be forced to accept defeat and make peace before the full brunt of the Russian military, which was still largely in Europe, could be slowly shipped east to be brought down on Japan. Here, the plan ran into problems pretty rapidly. Japanese tactics called on the forces of the Imperial Army to advance rapidly, seizing the offensive and trying to encircle the main Russian army to crush it. However, the Russian commanders on the scene were also aware of the strategic situation, and crucially, they knew that all they had to do was play for time. In the area of the Far East, Japan had numerical advantage, but the sheer size of the Russian Empire meant that over time, as more and more forces could be shipped to the east via the Trans-Siberia Railway, the balance would tip. All the Russian commanders had to do was waste time, retreat if they needed to, and above all, not lose decisively. And this is exactly what they did. The land battles of the Russo-Japanese War read like an exercise in futility. In a series of clashes at the Yalu River, Nanshan, Motien, and elsewhere, Japanese forces advanced, took the offensive, and did beat the Russians, driving them from their positions. But every time, in every battle, the Russian forces were able to retreat without being encircled, and Japanese tactics, which still relied heavily on infantry charges into fortified positions where the bayonet and raw fighting spirit would carry the day, were incredibly bloody. In the very first land battle of the war, Japan saw 6 times as many combat deaths as it had suffered in the entirety of the Sino-Japanese War 10 years earlier. Even the biggest Japanese land victory of the war at Mukden still saw massive losses on the Japanese side and about 70% of the Russian army able to withdraw in good order. Meanwhile, a second land objective, seizing Port Arthur itself in a land attack to force the Russian Far Eastern Fleet out to sea where it could be crushed by the Imperial Navy, proved hard going, to put it mildly. The commander in charge of the Port Arthur siege, General Nogi Maresuke, was a samurai of the old school without much military training, and supposedly he couldn't even read a terrain map. Thus, he ordered his men constantly to charge uphill into fortified positions, essentially giving them suicide orders. It was only when he was quietly relieved of office and command handed over to his second, Kodama Gentaro, who correctly identified elevated terrain the Japanese could seize and use to clear the remaining Russian defenses, that Port Arthur finally fell. Ultimately, 2 factors won the war for Japan. First was the Russian Revolution of 1905, which revealed the weakness of Tsarist rule in Russia itself. The revolution was not a direct result of the war, as Russia had a few other problems in the early 20th century, from ethnic strife to corruption, but the heavy cost of a war the government had promised would be over quickly did contribute. A few months later came the second reason, the humiliating defeat of the Russian Baltic Squadron, which had slowly made its way around the entire world pretty much, to reinforce the fleet in Asia, only to be ambushed and crushed by the Japanese at the Battle of Tsushima, securing Japan's control of the seas. Ultimately, Tsar Nicholas II decided that the time had come to negotiate rather than continue a war that was unpopular at home over a remote part of his empire. The final settlement, when it came, and it was negotiated, by the way, by American President Theodore Roosevelt as a neutral intermediary, made it clear Japan had won, but not as decisively as it had 10 years earlier against China. Japan was given Russian possessions in Manchuria, as well as ownership of a lease Russia had signed of Port Arthur, amounting to a strong sphere of influence in northeastern China. It also got the southern half of Sakhalin Island, but no indemnity to cover the cost of the expensive war, news of which caused riots in Tokyo when the populace found they'd have to see their taxes go up to cover the war debt. We'll talk more about that next week. Still, Japan had won, the first Asian power to defeat a European one in centuries, and in doing so, it had decisively secured itself a seat among the great powers of the world. However, like the Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War was a poison pill of a sort. Having expanded their empire into Manchuria, Japanese military planners now began to push for even more resources to defend it, and to expand new buffer zones to protect Manchuria, again itself intended to protect Korea. Ideas like this led to an expensive 4-year-long intervention in the Russian Civil War that saw Japan waste huge quantities of men and materiel in a doomed effort to prop up the White Russians against the Bolsheviks and divide Russia, thus permanently weakening it on the international stage. The war also provided several lessons to the imperial military with very negative long-term consequences, from the success of the Port Arthur sneak attack informing plans for Pearl Harbor, to a renewed confidence in the superiority of Japanese fighting spirit over decadent Europeans and others, and a subsequent disregard for tactical and technological improvements to Japanese land forces in favor of the good old-fashioned infantry charge. All these lessons would come back to bite a military leadership that viewed the Russo-Japanese War as its single greatest triumph, as they tried to replicate the same tricks against the US in World War II, not realizing that beating Russia had more to do with the problems of Russia than Japan's strategy, and that the United States in 1941 is not Tsarist Russia in 1905. Still, we're a long way from all this, and in 1905, Japan was pretty unambiguously one of the great powers of the world, with a burgeoning colonial empire in Korea, Taiwan, and Manchuria. And that status did only improve as time went on, at least at first. In the fall of 1941, the Tokyo government seized on the opportunity presented by a British request under the terms of the Anglo-Japanese alliance to enter World War I. Why would they want to enter World War I? Wasn't that the bad one with all the trenches and the weird diseases and the going over the top and all that? Well, because Germany did have some holdings in Asia, mostly a small enclave at Qingdao in China's Shandong Peninsula and down in Micronesia, and more importantly because those holdings were not really defended at all. After all, the war was mostly happening in Europe. Thus, Japan could sweep in to help its ally by seizing both territories before the end of 1914 with minimal casualties, and then spend the next few years pressuring the Allies to let Japan keep its new territories for contributing to the war effort. Meanwhile, Japan itself became one of the major suppliers of the Allied side. Alongside the United States, Japan did very well selling the Allies ammunition, medicine, cloth for bandages and uniforms, and pretty much everything else they needed to keep the war effort going. In the final peace deal at Versailles in 1919, Japan was even granted a seat as one of the great powers, deciding the final outcome of the peace, the only non-Western country to get that recognition. Thus, in many ways, by 1919, the dream of Meiji had been achieved. Japan was a great power, ranked among the other powers of the West as one of their peers, and having secured its own colonial empire worthy of its new status. Of course, not consulted in any of this were the actual residents of the places Japan had secured for its own defense, and it's their story I want to conclude today with. I do want to be upfront about two things. First, I am not going to try and be comprehensive in telling the story of the colonization of Korea, Taiwan, or anywhere else. That would be its own separate series with dozens of episodes, and to be honest, I'd feel a bit awkward even trying, because I just don't know Korean or Taiwanese or Micronesian history as well as I know Japan's, and thus I don't feel as academically qualified to tackle something that is as much or more the story of those places as it is Japan's. Second, I'm not going to go super in-depth on some of the most horrifying aspects of the colonial legacy, like Unit 731, the Comfort Women, or anything else in this or future episodes. That's because A, I have done full episodes on those things in the past, and they are in the archive if you are curious, and B, I want this specific series to be accessible to anyone, which feels a bit at cross purposes with an in-depth discussion of horrific violence and mutilation. But I want to be clear that those things did happen. All of it is very well documented, and that these things are horrible and morally unconscionable. With that said, colonial policy towards the colonized locals was broadly defined by two things: inconsistency and exploitation. The inconsistency mostly came from the perceived end goal of colonization. The bureaucrats of Tokyo's so-called Takumusho, or Ministry of Colonial Affairs, to go alongside its finance ministry and foreign ministry and all that, could never really agree on what the end goal of colonization actually was. Some advocated for what they called kolminka, roughly subjectification, in other words, making Koreans or Taiwanese into kolmin, imperial subjects of Japan through assimilation. On the other hand were bureaucrats who maintained more of a racialized view of colonization inspired by Western colonial empires, and considered non-Japanese immutably separate from the natives of Japan. These two wings of the colonial bureaucracy had differing levels of influence depending on where in the empire you're talking about, and the perceived relationship of the colonized subjects to Japan itself. Thus, for example, the Ryukyuan natives of Okinawa, culturally and linguistically very close to the Japanese themselves, were subject to policies intended to forcibly assimilate them, banning the Ryukyuan language from all official spaces, including the school system, and converting sacred spaces associated with Ryukyuan folk religion into Shinto shrines. However, the Ainu aboriginals of Hokkaido were subject to the 1899 Kyūdōjin Hogoho, or Former Aboriginals Protection Act, which pushed them into distinctly non-assimilationist communities modeled on the reservation system imposed on Native Americans in the US, based in the most out-of-the-way parts of the island. That particular law, by the way, wasn't actually repealed until 1997, when it was replaced by laws promoting the preservation of Ainu culture. Meanwhile, the old Ainu kotan, or settlements, were removed to make room for modern cities filled with Japanese settlers, governed from a centerpiece showcase capital at Sapporo, which was intended to be a showcase of Japanese modernity, complete with a street grid and Western-inspired architecture and lots of parks. This being the age where progressive reformers in the West were first pushing the idea of city parks as a way to improve urban living. Okinawa and Hokkaido were eventually annexed outright and incorporated into the civilian governing structure. In Korea and Taiwan, though, the military controlled the colonial system. Not that it made for a more consistent policy. Depending on who you got as governor general, you could see very different policies. For example, early in Japan's occupation of Taiwan, the government general imposed rules intended to defend traditional Confucian education, a way of winning over the locals by endorsing their customs. In Korea, Confucian was turned up to 11 because some imperial propaganda emphasized the idea that Korean and Japanese cultures were fundamentally related because of their shared ancient history. This is something that interestingly doesn't appear much in right-wing nationalist discourse after 1945, but that used to be there a lot. The idea that Japan's ancient ties to Korea meant that in fact the two countries shared one culture, which was also a justification, of course, for saving Korea via colonization to reunite the two. Of course, despite this ancient ineffable ancestral tie or whatever, Koreans were never treated as equals. Instead, the rhetoric of reunification was used to justify a brutal campaign of forced assimilation, which saw the Korean language forced out of schools, newspapers, and other public spaces, while Korean names were replaced with Japanese ones. Those who dissented from forced assimilation, like a generation of brave Koreans did in 1919, were subject to harsh crackdowns. In that year, public discourse was dominated by the liberal rhetoric of the victorious World War I allies, and especially the American President Woodrow Wilson, whose post-war vision promised self-determination for all peoples. In other words, self-rule for anyone who wanted it. That promise, of course, was at best only dubiously applied in Europe and not really anywhere outside of it, but the rhetoric was inspiring, and in March 1919, Korean activists and students protested for their self-determination. A group of them even penned a declaration of independence from Japan. Then came the reprisals. Official Japanese figures say just shy of 50,000 people were arrested for involvement in the protests, at least 700 were killed, but the real number is probably higher. 1,100 is the most common estimate, and some scholars have estimated that's an undercount by at least a few thousand. Thousands of Koreans were called upon to demonstrate their loyalty to Japan during the wars of the 30s and 40s, with men being conscripted into the army. The Navy never took them for fear of sabotage of its expensive ships. Women were impressed into a program of sexual slavery at the behest of the military, euphemistically referred to as the Comfort Women Program. The horrors of this latter program in particular are the source of much ongoing tension between Japan's modern government and the people and government of South Korea. In Micronesia, meanwhile, the locals were treated as fundamentally uncivilized, separate even from East Asians because of their culture and language, and not allowed access to the same levels of education. For example, anything beyond basic literacy was uncommon. Most were trained to be laborers in Japanese mines and plantations, living in fear of having their homes expropriated and converted into more useful roles, like yet more plantation land, or homes for Japanese overseers. I've done longer series on Japan's relationships with each of these places. The 8-part series on Japan-Korea relations starts with episode 155, the Taiwan series is 4 parts, starting with episode 252, and the Micronesia one is also 4 parts, starting with episode 472. I've also done ones on Japan's relationship with the Ryukyus, 2 parts, episodes 33 and 34, and the colonization of Hokkaido, 5 parts, starting with episode 371. If you're interested in any of those subjects, I recommend going back through the archives using the various tags to see what there is. There's a lot more than I could realistically do justice to in a series like this. That said, I hope this gives you some sense of the main takeaways I'd want to have from any discussion of the Japanese Empire. Today, right-wing revisionists in Japan defend the empire by suggesting that A, it was for the benefit of the locals, and B, because Japan is also an Asian nation, its colonial empire was somehow fundamentally different from, say, the British. The historical record does not back up either of these very revisionist claims, and that's something I want to be very clear about. Japan's empire was deeply self-serving, and any honest analysis of this period has to start with acknowledging that simple premise. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shout-out tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Layla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Roberta Prine, William Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sy, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Reese, Inoue Enrio's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, Jennifer Pianzio, James, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Special thanks also to new donors to the History of Japan Patreon, Derek and Larry, for donating to support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time for the rise of Japanese democracy at home.